Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here for this the anti-racism presentation session. I hope that you've been able to engage in the session before this and the keynote this morning. My name is Joshua Kanda. I'm the Director of Strategic Partnerships in the Office of the Provost at Azusa Pacific University, and I am really excited to be hosting and then kind of facilitating Q&A after these anti-racism presentations. So I'm going to do some quick introductions of our speakers, and then we are going to go into the video, and then afterwards we will have Q&A. I will say, as the speakers are talking and you're watching the videos of their presentations, please feel free to enter questions in the Q&A box at that point, so we have a couple kind of preset and have a queue of them to the Q&A to expedite that process. So to introduce our speakers, we have Angela Jackson, who is a core faculty member of the Master's in Counseling program at Concordia University, Irvine. Her topic will be speaking on a matter of heart and policy. We have Kathy Chow, who is a doctoral student at Yale University, speaking about reimagining responses to anti-Asian racism beyond exposure. We have Andrea Michelle Ortega, who's a doctoral student at George Fox University and addressing the deadliest virus, hate in America. And finally, we have Natalie Reynoso, who is a doctoral student at Fordham University, speaking about reevaluating the category of the human, an anti-racist approach to scholarship and pedagogy in the liberal arts. So a really exciting, diverse group as far as kind of epistemology and approach to this topic. So I'm excited to get into a robust conversation afterward. So we'll go into the video, and I hope that you enjoy.
Hello, my name is Dr. Angela Jackson. I am excited to be here presenting at this virtual conference with APU. I am focusing on eradicating racist policies and practices in our country, as well as in higher education, liberal arts education. So my topic is a matter of the heart and policy. And I think that even if we, change policies, which many policies have been changed, over the years, even centuries, I have to say that sometimes I feel like the hearts have not been changed. And that means that when we look at our racial injustices in society and our relationships and cross-cultural relationships, where do we really stand at the heart? Are we really trying to undo hardness and bitterness and hatred? Or are we just staying, in those hard places emotionally and in our spirits and saying, let's, just deal with the systematic policy part? I think we need both. As I'm speaking, in April 2021, we are really dealing with some tough issues, the continual racial harassment, some call domestic terrorism in our country, in our cities, especially with our Black and brown people. We recently had a lieutenant who is African-American and Latino with our Army, US Army, was pulled over for driving, from many perspectives of a lot of people, for driving a brand new car and not having his license plate visible. And so he, just really struggled, and I think has a lawsuit. This is in Virginia, with that entity, the police department entity, for how he was treated. And then we recently have had Dante Wright, who actually was murdered, which, shot and died, so unarmed. And, just these types of traumas they, even if we change, and we are in the midst of changing our criminal justice system, which is, we need a national, I think, mandate on how to do that. But the point is, what about the hurts? Are we dealing with the inner spirit and soul of the hatred and the aggression and the energy that's given towards people of color that are beyond even the policies? So I am going to briefly just touch on race, because race is a social construct. So it was created. So 400 years of enslavement of African Americans in this country has allowed for free labor, chattel, which, free labor, which was chattel slavery to Europeans. And African Americans built this country. And we also have other, that foundation of enslavement of a people for free labor and for oppression and economic power has caused these racial traumas and these tears in the soul. And this is on America and all assets of all parts of our society. So education, it shows up in our churches with division. It shows up with the denial in our hiring practices, in our educational institutions, in our criminal justice system. So race being identified in this country has created this classism and these divisions that have are embedded in our systems, which is another word for systematic racism, which I just mentioned, systematic racism, because if we don't address how we can break these systems of inequalities and inequities so that some groups, people of color, don't have to pull themselves by their bootstraps to get the education that they deserve, to get the health care they deserve, to be treated with human dignity, to have opportunities to, when you do go to college, that you've had an education in K through 12 that prepares you accordingly. And then we must address economic power, because the historical baggage in this country has left brown and Black people not having the generational wealth, not getting the, I'll speak for African Americans, not getting the 40 acres and a mule is the bare minimum to leave some economic empowerment and advantages to future generations. So white privilege, yes, that is a term that's been around for a while. Peggy McIntosh created it. And so she is a white female, and she created the term because she started to recognize that she had access to unearned privileges that she could bank on, cashing in on every day. And so again, back to the racial profiling in our criminal justice system, whites do not have to think about, if I have a brand new car and I don't have my license plates, will I be considered suspect? If I have, air fresheners hanging in my rearview window, would that be a distraction for me to be pulled over? And we can go on and on and on. I can't breathe. The trial of George Floyd is happening as this conference will be happening. And during the preparation of this conference, and then during this conference, I believe. And so I am still, I can't even listen to the recordings of George Floyd crying out, because it tears my soul. We have to become conscious. There's no more denial. There's no more being okay to be unconscious and ignore the realities that are happening that have kept these racial divide and these unfair and basically racist policies. That white privilege shows up Obviously, I've said in our judicial system, but definitely in our churches. You know, does everybody feel welcome? Are they getting the same message at the pulpit? Are some church entities just thriving or have a power in a way that others do not? Look at our housing and our education. And again, education, our liberal arts education, what can we do to say that, wow, these are some policies? You know, first of all, let's get some numbers. Often numbers of the racial, numbers of our administrators, our staff, our students, our faculty are not even made known, you know, in an open forum that says this is who we are. That needs to happen. And then beyond EEO policies, because often we have those and we're not enforcing them. So we have to do more. And we need people at the table of color that basically have power to make decisions. And I'm saying people of color that are culturally competent, because we all need to be educated about being culturally competent. That means aware of our biases, aware of who we are, bringing that to the table, having some skills to communicate cross-culturally, et cetera. So as I close here, I just want to bring up, you know, these hegemonic structural powers. That's when we do have a dominance of power of one group over another, and the inequities of, you know, the disproportionality. For example, we have African-American males in prison at a much higher rate than their percentage of being U.S. citizens. So this is an outrage, and this has to stop. So I'm frustrated. I'm working on not being so angry, because that tears at my own soul. But what are we going to do to bring down these walls? So the last piece is that, again, a takeaway. We need people of color in our higher education, liberal arts programs that can make decisions about curricula. What books are we using? Who makes those decisions? Who can create courses? Who's at the table? Are students at the table of color that say, this is what I need in my classrooms? And so we need to bring and welcome. And even, I'm going to back up for a second. I'm beyond bringing someone to the table. People of color, if you're listening and watching this, you need to come to the table. The invitation, you may not ever get that. And then those that are in positions of leadership, white privilege, please do your job to unravel systematic racism. Own and use the language. Speak of who you are. Say, I'm a white privileged male or white privileged female in a position of power, and this is my plan to change. It's not, you know, and even if you say that, this is the plan that this is going to be executed. So you're not just saying it verbally. We want behavioral change. So thank you so much. I hope that you enjoyed this brief dialogue, and God bless.
In recent months, my social media feeds have been populated by posts publicizing incidents of anti-Asian violence. These posts come from Asian American news outlets like Asian Feed and Nextjark, which distribute ready-to-share posts with heart-wrenching, clickbaity titles such as 75-year-old Asian elder dies after brutal assault in Oakland, man bashes 54-year-old Asian woman's face with a pipe and yells racial insults in NYC attack, and elderly Filipino man viciously beaten in Oakland carjacking. These posts are often accompanied with images of the bruised and battered faces of the victims. Another phenomenon of recent years is online indignation about Orientalist cultural appropriation. You might recall that at the beginning of 2021, 3 white women from Texas launched a mahjong set that sought to give the centuries-old Chinese Chow game a modern makeover. In 2019, a white restaurateur opened Lucky Lee's, a Chinese restaurant that served healthy Chinese food, such as lo mein that wouldn't make people feel bloated and icky the next day. That's a quote. Both incidents blew up on social media as Asian Americans took to various platforms to denounce these white entrepreneurs. These responses to anti-Asian racism and Orientalist appropriation rely implicitly on the logic of exposure. The logic of exposure believes that the project of exposing the fact that violence, in this case against Asian American communities, exists inevitably leads to the mitigation of that violence. In other words, the logic goes something like, as long as I make people aware of this violence, the violence will go away. As such, the logic of exposure believes that the act of exposure is inherently an act of social justice. In this paper, I link this recent spate of social media activism with the longer tradition of Asian American theological writings, which are focused on exposing the violence of the US state in Asia or racial violence against Asian Americans. I show that the assumption underlying both activism as exposure on social media and Asian American theological writings seems to be that if scholars and activists can raise awareness about violence against Asian Americans, then the violence will end. Yet, as queer theorist Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick has argued, the recourse to exposing violence that is used to discipline, in this case Asian American subjects, ironically amplifies that violence through exposure. In other words, if the violence is inflicted to control a group of people through fear, then that violence, giving that violence more airtime could exacerbate its disciplinary effect. In this section, I do not want to name names because I see this as a collective problem rather than an individual one. As such, the goal is not to call people out, but to show a trend in Asian American theological scholarship. The work of exposure takes on two forms in Asian American theology. One is the rehearsal of the history of racism and empire. In a number of works, Asian American theologians recount the history of US imperialism in Asia. They describe US involvement in the Korean War and the Vietnam War. They decry the ongoing expansion of the US military-industrial complex. The second form of exposure is the recounting of incidents of racism that the author has personally experienced. Asian American theologians include visceral experiences of racism in their theological writings. In a frequently cited essay in an anthology of Asian American theology, a prominent scholar recounts going to a shopping center to purchase some perfume, only to be ignored by the white clerk, being in conversations with other white people and getting looked over, and being called "hey boy" by white people. In another essay in a different anthology, another well-known scholar details an experience of being harassed by a crossing guard and then a mob at an intersection. I suspect that a desire for anti-Asian racism to be taken more seriously underlies the inclusion of these personal stories. In a world where woundedness and violence hold value in the attention economy, the inclusion of the author's own experiences of racism could be a personal plea for the reader to take anti-Asian racism seriously, when it has so often been enlightened in both theology and wider societal discourses. It is not my intention to make light of US imperialism in East Asia and these personal incidents with racism. They are abhorrent and should be named as such. Indeed, I suspect that my politics are generally aligned with the Asian American theologians I cite. But I do wonder about the efficacy of the ongoing recourse to exposure. As the queer theorist Eve Sedgwick argues, exposure may be less efficacious than it is hoped to be. She identifies the work of exposure as a part of the hermeneutics of suspicion or paranoid reading, where the reader of the text, situation, etc., reads with an eye towards all of the hidden injustices. Paranoia is anticipatory. It wants to know everything in advance. It is afraid of surprises and seeks to protect the paranoiac from surprises without recognizing that there can also be good surprises. Thus, paranoia assumes that we already know what is bad, we just need to figure out how the bad things work. It controls the presentation of ideas before the ideas present themselves to us. Sedgwick points out that having an unmystified view of systemic oppressions does not intrinsically or necessarily enjoin one to have to any specific train of epistemological or narrative consequences. In other words, even when one is able to identify the systemic oppressions at play, the possession of that piece of knowledge alone does not do any work by itself. Indeed, the violence that is used to discipline, in this case, Asian bodies, is actually amplified through exposure. That is, the exercise of violence against certain racialized bodies is typically done with the aim of instilling fear in that population. The harasser yells, "Go back to where you came from," with the hope that this will instill fear in the Asian American subject and inspire her to leave. Amplifying that violence through social media then simply amplifies the harasser's message. One might argue in response that the work of exposure does a special kind of work in combating anti-Asian violence, because anti-Asian violence has routinely been neglected. This much is evident in the somewhat disturbing way that a strange thrill erupts across Asian American communities when incidents of anti-Asian violence are publicized. This uncanny feeling is well captured by Anne Anling Chang's recent op-ed. As I saw these recent incidents of anti-Asian violence unfold in the news, she writes, I felt a profound sense of grief, but I also experienced something akin to relief. Maybe, I thought, now people will start to respond to anti-Asian violence with the same urgency they apply to other kinds of racism. Given the value of woundedness and violence in the attention economy, publicized proof of anti-Asian violence seems necessary to make people care. But what has been the result of all of this exposure? For one, an increased sense of fear and insecurity among the Asian American community. This has in turn led to increased gun sales among Asian Americans and the hiring of private armed guards. There have also been movements for increased policing, in spite of the fact that research has shown that increased policing does not necessarily result in reduced crime rates, not to mention the obvious links between increased policing and mass incarceration. Indeed, it's worth noting that policing and surveillance have been extremely harmful in the lives of poor Asian American communities. Massage parlors, for example, have been frequently subject to police raids, leading to the loss of employment and housing for sex workers. In short, it would seem that one affective result of the work of exposure is the proliferation of a sense of insecurity and a consequent desire to protect oneself against external threats. This desire has in turn fueled actions that adversely impact poor BIPOC populations. Thus, instead of a continuous recourse to exposure, I want to invite you to consider other possibilities. But rather than supplying a neat bundle of ready-made answers like an Instagram post, I leave you with some questions. To start, what might it look like to refuse the attention economy's obsession with violence? More specifically to my Asian American friends, what if I told you that you don't need to be defined or humanized by the pain that you or others in our community have experienced? And to allies, what can you do to respond to the institutional, cultural, and systemic violence against Asian Americans that is not the distribution of more images of anti-Asian violence?
Addressing the deadliest virus, hate in America. Xenophobia stems from the hatred or fear of foreigners, and it has deep roots in American history. German immigrants in colonial Pennsylvania were seen by British settlers as threats to the colony due to their different political and religious views, as well as the distinct ethnic differences. German immigrants proved their loyalty to the British during the 7-Year War, giving them a newfound whiteness that increased their political power. The British xenophobic behavior then shifted towards Native Americans, foreignizing them in their own land. Xenophobia evolved again as America expanded into a larger, more powerful nation, applying xenophobic slander to the Mexican Republic and different Indian nations, with newspapers and scientific journals influencing public opinion by writing about lazy Mexicans and savage Indians. A further shift occurred during American expansion towards the West, where the negative light was aimed towards Irish Catholics who were labeled as dirty or savages. The xenophobic behavior promoted American nativism, as well as hatred and violence against Irish immigrants. During the last half of the 19th century, the growth of transportation increased immigration. The Irish gained whiteness, like the Germans, by shifting the target towards Chinese immigrants. Arguments circulated the rhetoric that Chinese immigrants were stealing American jobs, but large numbers of Chinese migrant workers were actually hired for cheap labor. However, there was also this idea that Chinese people were disease carriers, and migrant workers were subjected to humiliating medical inspections after arriving to San Francisco, inspections that Europeans did not have on Ellis Island. Unlike the German and Irish, and like the Native Americans, Chinese were unable to claim whiteness. In its place came the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, the first immigration law to exclude an entire ethnic group. Historically, xenophobia was used to combat social upheaval, especially in the face of uncertainty. Projecting blame onto different groups provides a distraction, a quick solution, an alleviation of fear, and an emotional outlet. The result of this blame is violence, hate, and loss of innocent lives. This is highly prevalent today, during the age of coronavirus pandemic, where the target of xenophobic behavior, hate crimes, violence, and microaggressions are Asian Americans. Ever since the world first heard about the virus Wuhan, China was experiencing in December 2019, there was this idea that this virus is largely Asian. News media all over the world and major world leaders perpetuated this idea by calling the virus the Wuhan virus or the Chinese virus, with the former president of the United States even going further by calling it the Kung flu. The disease became associated with those who were Chinese or those who looked Asian in general. The conceptualization of a foreign virus resulted in people associating the virus with foreign people. By February 11, 2020, the World Health Organization officially gave the virus a new name that abided by the guidelines, which included avoiding offense to any cultural, social, national, regional, professional, or ethnic groups. However, world leaders and media continued to call it the Chinese virus. This is a form of microaggression, as it is a verbal slight that identifies a contagion to a group of people, increasing anti-Asian sentiment. The uncertainty surrounding the virus was frightening. Not only was the source unknown, but the rate it was spreading was so fast and the death toll continued to increase. The lack of information served to create more fears towards people of Chinese origins. This did not create new biases and stereotypes, but only brought latent ones to the surface. Placing the blame of a dangerous contagion onto a minority group is historical in this nation. The racist approach of othering Asian bodies was seen with the bubonic plague starting in China and traveling west in the 19th century. This disease was framed as one that can only infect Asian bodies, but white bodies remained immune. This resulted in Honolulu police burning down Chinatown in 1899 and San Francisco authorities quarantining Chinatown residents in 1900. In 2003, the SARS outbreak happened, and again, there was a focus on Chinatown as the epicenter for the disease, and people avoided Asian-owned businesses, and Asian Americans faced increased anxiety due to the increased threats. The fear and blame of what is or looks foreign was also prevalent in economic downturns, such as in 1982, where Vincent Chin, a Chinese American, was beaten to death by two Americans who blamed him for the influx of Japanese cars in the American market. When COVID-19 started spreading in the United States in 2020, there was an outpour of hate crimes and microaggressions from Americans towards Asian Americans because of the media portrayal of blaming China, specifically Wuhan. On April 28, 2020, data show that 30% of Americans witnessed someone blame an Asian individual for the virus. In 1 month, March 19 to April 23, there were almost 1,500 instances of anti-Asian behaviors. There were physical altercations at bus stops, subways, stores, and on the street. Vandalism of Asian businesses and verbal harassment were at a high, with words like "stop eating dogs" and "take the corona back, you chink." One Burmese American family was stabbed at a Sam's Club in Texas. The father, 4-year-old, and 2-year-old were attacked by a man who believed the family was Chinese and spreading the virus in the store. Only a few months has passed in 2021, and already there have been reports of elderly Asian individuals being hit or pushed on the street. Hateful language, microaggressive behaviors, and hate crimes are all still prevalent. The United States is a nation that is leading the world in a number of COVID cases. It is a nation with groups of Americans who protest the use of masks as they believe it is a form of oppression, and yet Asian Americans are being blamed for the spread of the virus and are targeted and attacked on the streets. Not only do Asian Americans and the Asian population have to deal with the world placing blame on them, but they have to deal with the ongoing stereotype that all Asians are the same and they look the same. Targeting the Burmese American family because they were thought to be Chinese is just one example of this. The perception that an Asian-looking person is automatically Chinese shows the racial categorization of America. The lumping of Asians as one type of Asian is an erasure of culture, ethnicity, nationality, and individualism. Asian Americans have fallen under the model minority stereotype, which juxtaposes the view that Asians are carriers of disease. This model minority stereotype views Asians as hardworking, successful, wealthy, apolitical, quiet, problem-free, and keeping their head down to fit and avoid being targets in society. This stereotype serves to drive a wedge between Asian minority populations and other minority groups in America. It pits various groups of color against each other, especially considering how this model minority notion was popularized around the time of the Civil Rights Movement. This notion also supports the idea that Asian Americans are perpetual foreigners in this country. Being the model minority highlights the difference between Asian Americans and majority culture Americans. The result of this perspective is that they will never be seen as a true American, but are merely good immigrants. regardless of how long they have been in this country or whether they were even born in this country. However, this narrative can easily change to the view that Asian Americans are dirty or disease carriers, such as we have seen in the past and in the present. Asian bodies in the United States are and will always be foreign because they are either the ideal immigrant or they are the threatening foreigners this country should be afraid of. It portrays this idea that anyone who looks different, shares strange cultures, eats strange food, must be foreigner. They have never been viewed as a regular citizen of this nation. America has a long history of xenophobia. Learning from mistakes is part of human development and growth. So why hasn't America learned from their mistakes? It is time that we reimagine a nation that is anti-racist, one that takes the hurt and mistakes from the past and grows into an accepting and loving nation. America needs to stop judging people by the color of their skin. John 7:24 says, "Do not judge by appearances, but judge with right judgment." In John 15:13, Jesus says, "This is my commandment, that you love one another as I loved you." It would do well for America to not make superficial judgments and to love everyone because we are all equally loved by God. Jesus washed his disciples' feet to show that we should all love and serve each other equally. Therefore, in order to move past the cycle of hate, America must learn to love and accept everyone, to love and accept differences. America must weep with those who weep, Romans 12:15, in order to feel the pain of the oppressed and to truly understand the injustice that is happening in this nation. Leviticus 19:33-34 says, "When a stranger sojourns with you in your land, you shall not do him wrong. You shall treat the stranger who sojourns with you as the native among you, and you shall love him as yourself, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt." As people of God, we must never forget that we are the Ger Toshav, the resident aliens of this land, or else we will be unable to connect and empathize with the struggles of minority populations. The pain and suffering that minority populations continue to feel to this day is showing that something needs to change. We must reimagine a nation where America learns from their racist past and xenophobic behaviors to stop the continuation of this cycle of hate and blame.
Hi, my name is Natalie Reynoso, and I am a PhD student at Fordham University in the Theology Department. This talk is titled Reevaluating the Category of the Human, an Anti-Racist Approach to Scholarship and Pedagogy in the Liberal Arts. In the wake of the countless deaths of Black people at the hands of police officers, and in the midst of a public health crisis that has disproportionately impacted people of color in this country, I have found myself in the course of the last year at a particularly sobering and devastating place that has called me to great responsibility. As a graduate and student instructor of color at Fordham University, I felt an urgent need to respond to these ongoing crises by further diversifying my syllabus so as to speak more directly to the ongoing reality of Black death and to other numerous iniquities faced by Black and Brown lives. The goal was not simply to increase the number of scholars whose work appeared on my syllabus, assuming that this alone would constitute the work of diversifying a syllabus and of engaging in anti-racist pedagogy. For as Bell Hooks aptly puts it, quote, "Simply changing content does not accurately represent progressive visions of the way commitment to cultural diversity can constructively transform the academy," end quote. In fact, the very opposite can happen. Solely changing content on a syllabus to assure that one includes the voice of an underrepresented racial minority, as though aiming to reach an unspecified quota, can dangerously result in a kind of tokenism that is more reductive than it is constructive. Instead, I sought to change the lens with which I framed my course, Faith and Critical Reason, an introductory course to the fields of theology and religious studies, and one that is required as part of Fordham's liberal arts core curriculum. This process involves seriously considering how I might characterize the work of my field and of the university to engage in anti-racist pedagogy. While there might be variations in how each liberal arts university adapts its core curriculum, it can perhaps be said that in addition to prompting learning across disciplines and developing a student's written and oral expression, a liberal arts core curriculum aims on some level to engage with the entirety of the human experience in our classrooms with our students, regardless of the fields we are part of. Today, I would like us to consider how a liberal arts curriculum might succeed in engaging with the entirety of the human experience in our classrooms. How do we acknowledge the diverse experiences and backgrounds of our students and lead them to critically reflect on their own and on that of others? I want to suggest that in order to reflect critically upon human concerns in anti-racist, especially in anti-Black racist pedagogy is necessary. And in order to do this work, our courses and curricula writ large must first attend to the category of the human, how it has excluded minoritized persons, and how it has explicitly defined itself against Black life. For if we do not acknowledge those who are excluded from the category of the human, are we not merely reinscribing its bounds, fraught as they are by the history of chattel slavery? Moreover, I want to note that in evaluating the category of the human, we must also assess how our respective disciplines and the university and academic structures at large might have aided the construction of the human as not only excluding Black life, but also as engendering a Black non-being antithetical to it. And yet, how might our pedagogy also participate in what Sylvia Winter highlights for literary scholars, the necessary work of disrupting the powers that define the human? There is no singular answer to these questions, but I argue that anti-racism pedagogy must first and foremost begin with the partaking in what Christina Sharp calls wake work, and in so doing, attend to the afterlives of slavery as one of her interlocutors, Sadia Hartman, lays out for us. Together with the narration of her own experience traveling along a slave route in Ghana, Sadia Hartman's Lose Your Mother also provides an account of the history of the Atlantic slave trade route. Histories are narrated by means of introspection, she posits, for it is only after certain events are over that beginnings, causes, effects, and so forth are assigned. However, Hartman's work prompts one to acknowledge slavery as a past whose aftershocks are readily visible to anyone willing to look. She critically defines the afterlife of slavery as follows, and I quote, "Slavery had established a measure of man and a ranking of life and a worth that has yet to be undone. If slavery persists as an issue in the political life of the Black American, it is not because of an antiquarian obsession with bygone days or the burden of a too long memory, but because Black lives are still imperiled and devalued by a racial calculus and a political arithmetic that were entrenched centuries ago. This is the afterlife of slavery: skewed life chances, limited access to health and education, premature death, incarceration, and impoverishment." End quote. This is to say that the racial disparities facing Black lives present in socio-political and cultural contexts must be understood as part of the afterlife of slavery. And ultimately, what slavery allows us to comprehend, Hartman argues elsewhere, is, quote, "the strategies for degrading body into mere matter and the pile of corpses engendered by the language of the human," end quote. As part of the afterlife of slavery, the continued reality of premature Black death reaffirms an understanding of the human precipitated upon the notion of Black non-being. It is with attention to the afterlife of slavery that Christina Sharp's In the Wake on Blackness and Being critically situates her defining of the wake. I will focus on two interrelated elements of the wake as presented by Sharp. One, the wake as wakefulness or consciousness, and two, the wake as a problem of and forethought. Early on, Sharp defines the wake as a need for, quote, "a sense of wakefulness as consciousness, of a past that is not yet past, or rather of a past that continues to disrupt the present in ways that mark the untimely deaths of Black beings as normative." The wake, then, Sharp argues, must also be considered, quote, "as a problem of and for thought," which is to say that one must think with the care that acknowledges that the subject that gives us thought is precisely the subject against which Blackness becomes nothingness. Sharp states, quote, "thinking needs care, and that thinking and care need to stay in the wake," end quote. Part of this care requires a vigilance to premature Black death that Sharp describes as follows. What does it mean to defend the dead? To tend to the Black dead and dying, to tend to the Black person, to Black people, always living in the push toward death. It means work, hard, emotional, physical, and intellectual work that demands vigilant attendance to the needs of the dying, to ease their way, and also to the needs of the living. It is important to note, however, that Sharp is not interested in any resolution that aims to include Black being into the notion of the human. Instead, she is concerned with the reality that Black beings live in a climate that is anti-Black, and as a result, come to fall outside of and in excess to this category of the human. It is in the wake of such a reality that Sharp's work demonstrates how life is then mediated in this place of unsurvival. Ultimately, in order to contend with the weight, Sharp argues, we must, quote, become undisciplined. This is especially important because the academy has regulated what constitutes mainstream knowledge in ways that keep the work of scholars of color outside of the normative canon. In her own work, Sharp becomes undisciplined by looking to artistic representations that reflect the afterlives of slavery. Both Hartman and Sharp challenge one to rethink the category of the human. Hartman's work enables one to see how the language of the human that enabled the commodification of bodies in the Atlantic slave trade is precisely what allows for the afterlife of slavery to continue. Although Sharp is not after a new science of the human, as Winter proposes, and instead accepts the permanent nature of anti-Blackness, her work makes evident how the category of the human is in and of itself anti-Black. If we in our classrooms are to reflect critically upon human concerns and experiences, the human is a term that should figure prominently in how we think about pedagogical practices and in how we design our syllabuses. This requires us to confront the history of the Atlantic slave trade and its afterlife so as to begin to see how the category of the human remains anti-Black. And it necessitates that we attend to how our respective fields and the academy have been involved in the naming and the unnaming of the human. It is in this way that one can begin to engage anti-racist pedagogy. And so today, I ask us to consider, how might we tend to the Black dead and dying in our teaching? How might we be ever vigilant of the afterlife of slavery and the definition of the human sans Black life it maintains? And lastly, what is the hard, emotional, physical, and intellectual work, to quote Sharp, of attending to the wake look like in your field, in your department, in the courses you teach, and in your university? Bell Hooks, whose Teaching to Transgress considers how education might serve as a practice of freedom, notes that, quote, the classroom remains the most radical space of possibility in the academy. There are limits, end quote, There are limits to the work that can happen in the classroom, and I am not sure that any kind of emancipation is possible in such a space. But I do believe that most of us do this work because at one point or another, the classroom did serve as a radical space of possibility for us. And so I ask, how might we make our own classrooms a place of radical possibility for our students, even if we must do so with tempered hope? Thank you.
Thank you all for this the wonderful presentation. So as the audience is there, if you have questions, please continue to submit them as a few have come in. I will start off. Let's see. I've never. So now, I'm going to kind of keep you going with the presentation and just tie off of that. So, if kind of wrestling with Blackness not being kind of compatible with the category of human, from your perspective, it's playing off of your work or otherwise, what are the spiritual and intellectual tasks that we need to do to rewrite the category of human, or do we need to find kind of a new world or something outside of humanity to encapsulate the kind of ontological presence of Blackness?
Thank you. Yes, good question. So I think the immediate work in the classroom or in our respective scholarship is recognition. I think too often especially in classroom with students, and I think just even in our own work in terms of when we think about categories of being, the human is sort of taken as a stable category and as one that is inclusive of people, broadly speaking. And so I think what the initial work that happens in my classroom and the framing for whatever happens next is to have students recognize that by no means is this a category that's stable, And in every way is it a category that has been constructed. And to acknowledge the dangerous ways in which it has been constructed and the ways in which that construction has remained and has been perpetual, and has continued to be perpetuated. And so that comes to figure later on in different ways, is both looking at how that happens practically in the lives of Black people, particularly right now, as we're talking about violence at the hands of police officers. It also means taking them to the frame of mind of thinking about the border and what does it mean to call people aliens, and so on and so forth. But it starts for me by destabilizing a category that too often feels permanent to our students, and feels like it's a given that everyone has access to what it means to be a human. I don't know that I necessarily think nor want to rewrite the category. I think that in and of itself comes with a lot of implications. And so that's an ongoing question and an ongoing debate, I think, within the field itself, right? There are those who, like Sylvia Winter, who I talked about, do want to think about ways in which we reconsider this category. And then there are others, Afro-pessimist thinkers in particular, one of them being Christina Sharp, who I worked with, who I worked in conversation with in this piece, that really sees the climate that we're living in as too inherently anti-Black for there to be any room for Blackness in what we understand as the human. So the jury is out on whether or not that can be rewritten, and I'm hesitant to, but I think recognition is the place to start.
Yeah, thank you for that. Kathy, a question for you. So I think the problematizing exposure, one of the thoughts is the type of exposure important? So kind of thinking of the legacy of the civil rights movement and leveraging exposure via media as a way to animate and amplify that movement, kind of intentionally, strategically. That seems like it could be different than the overwhelming exposure that we have through social media. So from your engagement, is there a difference between the impact of purposeful, intentional, strategic exposure and then just the onslaught that I think that you addressed, that then ends up into kind of perpetuating and cultivating a sense of fear and anxiety that is potentially counterproductive, if you will?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. I think it points out the ways in which exposure as a potential problem becomes especially salient with the internet and all that provides. I think there's certainly different types of exposure. I guess the anxiety is more broadly a concern about the exposure of violence as a way of proving humanity, or to think about ways in which minoritized groups might feel that they need to expose their wounds, or to feed the kind of desire for images of pain in order to be recognized by the liberal state or something like that. That is what I'm primarily concerned about. I wonder, there could maybe be ways that you could do some kind of exposure work without feeding that desire for images of pain. But yeah, I guess that is the question, isn't it? Is that possible? But no, I think you're right. There's certainly different kinds, but yeah. I think the worry pervades. Yeah.
Right. Well, it's great. It's a difficult balance to be in, and then even where that fear, I would say not the anxiety, but the kind of like if there's realistic fear, kind of where that needs to be. I think of civil rights movement and King and others, and although nonviolent entities around them, whether it is Black Panther movements or earlier kind of the Deacons of Defense. So there were armed Black, often usually men, but women as well, who were also in solidarity with that. So that like real fear of physical and bodily violence, kind of this corporal violence was very much there. But yeah, it's this balance. So a question that was submitted that could be open to a few folks to answer is about kind of this public exposure, if you will, of xenophobia and the brutality and frequency of Asian hate. So someone is kind of asking, from your perspective, how accurate do you believe kind of media has been in representing the occurrences that have happened recently? And this is open, so it could be on either side of if it's kind of this, again, this onslaught, right, that kind of gets perpetuated and recycled, or if there are still, in your perspective, lots of things that are unreported. So where, from your perspectives, what is your gauge on that?
I can speak on this. In my opinion, I think that it's not 100% accurately represented. You see a lot of physical violence being reported, people getting shot, pushed, stabbed, and things like that. But I think it's really important for media to also portray the microaggressions that are a little bit more subtle, the verbal harassments that you hear walking down the street. That I think things like that and vandalism on restaurants and people's homes is not reported, and you don't really see it on media. And I personally didn't see it until I did my own research. And I think that's also very important to show that this is also happening, because many people think that small things like that you can ignore, but they add up and they hurt, and it is still a form of aggression and oppression to Asian Americans, and things like that you don't really see on media. So I don't think that it's accurately represented. And I'm talking to other people, I see this on social media, but then I took a step back because I follow people who share that. And you should not have to follow certain people to learn about these things. It should be on mainstream media, accessible to everyone, regardless of who you're following and who you're not following.
Yeah, that's what the fascinating. I mean, the fascinating piece, again, going back to social media, right? The pathways that we have there, and even kind of although the exposure is there may be it's in certain alleyways of the internet, right? And certain people that you follow on social media. Whereas there's a lot talked about, right, in the political elections in the past 6 years of echo chambers and all that. I think the same could be somewhat applied here. So, Angela, a question for you. So, thinking about one of the things that came up in your talk, and something that I thought about was Ben Simmons' work on equity mindedness from USC, and just the importance that her and her team have put on color consciousness and race consciousness as it regards colleges and universities, and how they view outcomes for students. Yet color blindness kind of persists, we know, in a particular way in Christian institutions, evangelical or otherwise, but particularly evangelical. And as like Bonilla Silva has talked about, like there's this new racism, that this colorblind racism that's often there. I guess in that, the hesitancy for people to really look at race, really look at the data in those regards. How do you see, what do you see as, I guess, the heart issue that is prevalent or that is undergirding that hesitancy to do so?
I'm going to call it, my initial thoughts are fear. Fear based in shame, fear based in guilt. Robert DiAngelo has a book called White Fragility. And so we have to be comfortable with being uncomfortable about what the data really shows, and what our history shows. And so in our institutions. And so when we face that, be honest about that and face that reality, I think that's the first step. Where's the hesitancy? I think it has to do with, I'm going to be honest, possibly some bureaucracy. We have to kind of get through these systems and say, you know what, let's just cut to the chase here. We're going to keep having these same conversations of, oh, we don't know, how diverse our educational system really is, or we don't know where the gaps are, or we need help trying to figure it out. I think it's time out for that same narrative to keep being repeated. And I think being at a Christian university, let's look at our hearts, let's even grieve. And, Lamentations, the book in the Bible, it is about grieving, these painful experiences. Are we even doing that? As a therapist, I think I have a lot of clients coming to me that want to grieve over what's going on in that country, which I'm finding to be quite powerful. And I mean clients of all backgrounds, and I'm creating a space for these discussions. So even if you're not in therapy, you know, maybe some of us need to go to therapy. some of us administrators, some of us human beings need to say, wait a minute, how can I lead better? So yeah, those are some of my initial thoughts.
Yeah, for me, there's something interesting there in that the grieving and thinking a little bit from this Christian framework, even of the concept and idea of lament and kind of sitting in that and acknowledging it. I'm making a jump here, but it could be an interesting path to continue to go down, even of that as a part of being in the wake and being in this the legacies, the persistence, kind of again this afterlife. Yes, of slavery, but I think we could say kind of more broadly in our kind of racialized climate. But the ability to take the time to sit in it, to lament, to cry out, be angry, to have self-reflection, and feel that in a way that is generative to justice and equity for our own selves and for others. So, you know, one of the things that I think connected to a few of the presentations, specifically Andrea and Natalie, was this kind of concept of whether we label it kind of an Afro-pessimistic tradition, or we just kind of broad pessimism about the efficacy of the United States in particular to be a place in where peoples of color can thrive, be fully human, be fully present. So Andrea, you made this kind of comment in yours about Asian Americans kind of always being in this kind of otherness place, and always kind of in this kind of white supremacist kind of view and milieu. And then, you know, we kind of talked about the Afro-pessimistic side. Are there spaces, or what are the spaces that you see as potentially liberatory, whether that is in the classroom or outside? Are there windows into something that would push against that pessimistic narrative? And actually, anyone can answer this, but I wanted to address how they were in both of your presentations.
I'll have to think about that a little bit more. I think my initial answer is, at least in my own work and with my students, I'm not in a rush for them to move past the pessimist space, not because I want them to sort of live in that space, but to understand how we got there first. I also think like the language of when we talk about in some ways about moving past, we often are thinking like conversations come up about reparations and things of the sort, and that gets really heavy, hefty, complicated in ways that like it's great to introduce, but to run to that before we've done the work of understanding how we've gotten here, I think is damaging. And so before that, before sort of thinking about, at the very least, what I hope the classroom does, because I think there are limits to which it can be a liberatory place, and I don't know that it can be realistically, but I think the best that it can do is give students tools to then go out and in their own spaces and in their own communities, be disruptive in all the good ways, and have those hard conversations and continue to figure out like how can we move things forward, knowing how we got to this place first. So that's my initial response, but it's a really good question. I'll have to keep chewing on it.
Any others thoughts on that?
Could you rephrase the question for me?
Yeah, so kind of in the context and kind of one of the themes of like the pessimism of peoples of color, and I think specifically in this conversation, Asian Americans and Black folks being other, never being fully American, never being kind of fully in that. Is there an opportunity in the classroom or otherwise to have hope that would change, or is that just kind of a permanence that is a part of what it is to ontologically be present and even, if you will, kind of be human, is the flawed category that Natalie pointed out.
Oh, thank you. I hear you. You know, I'm thinking a few things. Initially, I think valuing your humanity is, you can't negotiate that. I think it should even be, you know, always have that discussion at the table. So some environments I think are growing and see you in your humanness, in addition to all the other contexts of who you are, race, gender, etc. So I think there's, you know, it depends on the space. But I think that we need the ongoing discussions. And I think Natalie was saying, you know, how did we get here? I like that approach as well, because it helps us to figure out, how did we get here? You know, what am I feeling? What am I thinking? How is this showing up and how I'm existing today? And then it helps people to create their own discussion of who they are in the context of all the different parts of us. So yeah, so I don't know if that answers your question, but that's what I'm thinking.
We're coming to the end, but I want to ask one last question that someone has put in the box. So they are looking, or they're asking this question about the church, and I think they mean the church as kind of like formally that body, and asking kind of how does the church, which is still on Sunday mornings, if you will, one of those segregated hours, how does that as an entity address this history, social construction of race in the United States in a way that is effective?
Well, I want to give you guys space to say something, but I'll just jump in briefly. I think the church has work to do. I think that we are used to going to our comfort zones of, you know, how we were raised, you know, being with our own culture, even having speakers in our church that look like us. So it's common for us to move in that direction. However, I find myself, even through this COVID time, listening to many ministers and pastors that don't look like me. So I think it's the thinking, the diverse thinking of the church leaders that will bring in the message of how we can heal. And then are open to that self-awareness and that beginning those conversations and not seeing it as an end, but this is ongoing.
I'm not sure I have an answer to the question about the church, but I do have I was thinking about the question about pessimism, and maybe this is somewhat linked, but I think there's some really interesting literature in Black studies responding to the Afro-pessimist term in part, the turn in part. So like David Marriott's book that rereads Manon and thinks about invention, or the idea that one maybe should not think of history as always fixed. So pessimism sometimes maybe has a tendency to think of history as being fixed in a certain way, but one has to like kind of hold the possibility of otherwise open, to not have it be assured, but to think that it's actually possible. And yeah, David Marriott's reading, a psychoanalytic reading of Fanon, is really helpful in this regard, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, I add a piece as we close this giving time. I actually think that, so going back even to I think the comment of lament, I think one of the things that the church can do, Christian spaces can do, is actually be open to that pessimistic place and worldview, because it is prevalent within scripture and prevalent within history, that there is this lack of, even with God, yes, there's this lack of assurance of kind of where there's Israelites or where others are positioned, and the hope that is going to come, and that is not a lack of faith, that is just acknowledgement of realism. And I think the church of all expressions could use a little more of that. Then I would also say, you know, I think this carefulness of confusing kind of diversity with justice and equity, of many of the, especially most recent studies of multi-ethnic churches, show that they end up being de facto white. They acquiesce to whiteness. so there's something problematic there. So I think there's this kind of acknowledgement that it needs to happen, and this awareness that it is not just the composition of a denomination, it's not just composition of a Sunday morning. It is much more about kind of culture, and it's much more about perspective, the allowance of again, allowance of lament, allowance of pessimism, allowance to kind of review theological history in a way. It's history not being, not itself being static. So we need to review theological history. And I don't know if those are tasks that the church wants to take all the time. But I would say, I thank you for the presenters. Thank you so much for the work that you put into this and this great conversation. I really appreciate it. And I'll probably be following a lot of you as you continue to write and do work, especially doctoral students. For those attendees, thank you for coming. We're going to kind of go into the lunch break, if you will, at least on the West Coast. But there are a few more sessions this afternoon that we would love to have you be at and participate in. So thank you again, all.